Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest presentation in Applied Marketing Sciences 2019 Coffee Break webinar series. Today's presentation is entitled How to Gain Valuable Insights with Customer Interviews. My name is Megan Foley. I'm a manager at Applied Marketing Science, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Carmel Dibner, a principal at Applied Marketing Science. Carmel has extensive experience in managing traditional qualitative and quantitative research projects in B2B and consumer markets. She's helped dozens of companies uncover critical customer insights to improve products, services, and customer experiences. We call our series Coffee Break Webinars because the purpose of each webinar is to provide a short presentation highlighting key topics related to innovation and insights. These presentations are not comprehensive, but instead touch upon key points we believe are important to successful innovation. We will take questions at the end, and I'd encourage you to submit them by typing in the chat window on the right side of your screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carmel.
Thanks, Megan. So today's presentation will talk about customer interviews and why you should conduct customer interviews. So as a beginning here, the article, The Voice of the Customer, was written by Abby Griffin and Professor John Hauser, a professor at the MIT Sloan School. And this paper was really about best practices for conducting research to understand your customers. And the first key step to this process is conducting customer interviews to truly try to understand what are your customers' wants and needs. It's the key step to any good voice of the customer. But what is voice of the customer? So if everything starts with really understanding your customers and having a good voice of the customer study, what makes a good research study? So the first thing is that it should be a complete set of customer wants and needs expressed in the customer's own words, organized by the customer, and prioritized in terms of what is most important to them and their current level of satisfaction. And today we're going to talk about the first two steps. How do you do customer interviews to truly understand a complete set of your customers' wants and needs and ensure that you're expressing them in the customer's own language and understanding their true intentions and their true desires for your products and services? So why engage customers in these voice of the customer interviews? So the first is that these interviews help in a number of different respects. Voice of the customer input can be used for product engineering, so to develop new functions and features in physical products. They can also be used to design better services, so new ways, for example, to deliver the products to the customers. They can help you to design a better experience and create unique events and encounters with your customers. And they can also help you to define new types of business models, such as entirely new ways to transact with your customers. So engaging in these voice of the customer interviews, we're able to capture all this important qualitative input that you would need to improve your products and services. But there's so many different ways to gather your customer needs. One is through focus groups. Focus groups are when you have a group of individuals, usually maybe about 5 to 8 people, who come together to give you their feedback on products and services and have a general discussion of their wants and needs. Sometimes there are mini focus groups that might only have, for example, 3 to 5 people, which lets you have more airtime from each individual respondent. These are typically moderated by a professional moderator who will guide the discussion and make sure that everyone participates and all voices are heard. Another option is one-on-one interviews. This is where an interviewer talks directly to one respondent in a conversation that typically lasts between 45 and 60 minutes in length. That's really been shown to be the right length of time to fully gather someone's opinions and get a complete set of customer wants and needs through conducting a series of one-on-one interviews. Another option is ethnography, where you observe people as they carry out a task or as they do things with your products or services. And this lets you not only rely on what people have said, but also look at observed behavior. Another option is online focus groups, and here's where you can invite 8, 10, 20, even 30 people to participate in an online focus group where the moderator submits questions online and asks people to type in their responses. These can be done in a synchronous way where everyone comes together at one point in time, or they can be done in an asynchronous way where everyone can log in over a period of time, say 1 or 2 weeks, on their own time schedule to submit their own thoughts and opinions, and then those can be aggregated by the moderator. So let's go through briefly the benefits and drawbacks of each method, because they all have their own pros and cons. With focus groups, the main benefit is that you can benefit from the group dynamics and the collaboration among the members of the group. So this often helps to go deeper, and people are able to build off of each other's thoughts and ideas, and it really creates a rich discussion. It is also a very efficient method if your time is short, because you can gather many opinions in a very short amount of time from a lot of people. And if you have your colleagues or clients watching, they're very entertaining because you see the dynamics between individuals, and you see how they bounce ideas off of each other as they tell you their thoughts and opinions. But there are some drawbacks, as with any method. The first is that it really requires a skilled moderator to conduct a focus group. They have to be able to keep track of what everyone has said and make sure everyone is participating, and really manage the dynamics in the room. Another drawback is sometimes there are a few very dominant personalities who really can manipulate who can really be dominating the entire conversation. And so the moderator should be skilled enough to prevent that from happening and making sure everyone's voices are heard. But there are certain group dynamics that can make it difficult to ensure everyone's participation when there are those dominant personalities. There's also limited airtime. So usually these groups might be 60 or 90 minutes in length, and then if you divide that by the number of people participating, each person doesn't get very much airtime at all. It could be in the order of 5 to 10 minutes per person. And so what happens as a result is you might not be able to go really in depth into any individual's thoughts and opinions on a number of topics, but you do get a sense of the group overall, how they're thinking. It's just not as in-depth per respondent. There's also the potential for groupthink, which is when one person presents an idea and then everyone else jumps onto that. Now, they may or may not have thought of that idea independently, had they been asked directly. And so you don't know if it's people's true opinions or if they're just engaging in groupthink and jumping on each other's ideas. And this can often be very difficult, if not impossible, to do in B2B settings where competitors might be in the same room. As you can imagine, there are a lot of challenges with that as well. The second option is one-on-one interviews. The biggest benefit of this is that it's easy to build rapport one-on-one with people. It's a conversation just with one individual, and you can really take their lead in terms of the topics that are most of interest to them and how they'd like to discuss and communicate those with you. You can also very easily probe on nonverbal cues, and we really encourage people in customer interviews to take advantage of the nonverbal cues. So look at people's facial expressions, their body language, their hand motions, to understand what areas they might have more to say about or where they might be holding back on other things that they haven't expressed verbally. And it's fine to ask about those. And for example, you could say, I know you sort of winced at the topic. Tell me more about that. Why was this, not appealing to you, or why did you have a bad experience? Respondents can demonstrate really complex ideas with their hands. If you're trying to understand a process or how people do things that might have many steps, people can really show you that with their hands. And if you do a one-on-one interview that's in person, that can be beneficial for them being able to convey more complicated ideas to you. It's also easier to coordinate busy schedules. So with focus groups, you have to make sure everyone can come at the same time to participate in a group. But with one-on-one interviews, you really only have to schedule around one person's time and availability. So that's much easier to schedule. One drawback is that they are very expensive because you are asking for one-on-one time with a respondent and you want their focused attention for a full hour or so. They're also very time-consuming. So whereas focus groups are extremely efficient in that you get to talk to, let's say, 8 people at a time over an hour and a half, you would need 8 hours to do one-on-one interviews with that same group and solicit all those opinions. So they just take longer to complete, but if your timeline allows for them, they might be a good option for you. Another option is ethnography, and remember, that's when we're observing people's behavior. So with ethnographies, you're able to uncover unstated needs, and you can see pain points and workarounds that people may have firsthand. You can also probe into those. We noticed you did this or that. Tell us about that. Why did you do it in that order? You can also take pictures or videos to demonstrate key findings. We find that a lot of our clients want to be able to go back to their teams and have people who weren't able to attend or participate in the ethnographies really see what that experience was like. You can do that with pictures or videos. And you might be able to recruit others to participate during the visit. So, we've often had times where people say, well, while you're here, why don't you talk to so-and-so? They're available. And then you're able to get opinions from more people just by being on site and in person. It also builds goodwill toward the clients and toward the interviewer to do these ethnographies. The drawbacks is a longer timetable, so you really can only do 1 or 2 of these per day. Doing more than that is difficult. Usually you'll want to allow 2 to 4 hours to do an ethnography, and that will really give you time to see the situation, see how they're working, observe what you need to see, and also give enough time that the respondent feels at ease with your presence, because that also takes a little bit of time for them to do things as they would as much as possible if you weren't there. And if it's too short a visit, that might not be possible. There's also some travel time and expense associated with these because you are going to the person you want to observe, so you have to budget that. You're a guest, which means that things are really on their terms. So, for example, they might need to take a phone call. They might get sidelined. Maybe you came to observe one thing, but they end up needing to work on something else. You might just have to wait. So it's really important to have some flexibility in mind when you're doing an ethnography and expect that things might not go exactly the way that you plan them, and that's okay. People are more prone to distractions because they're on their home turf and their natural environment. And it can be harder to record, especially if you might be doing the ethnographies in a noisy area like a factory. Another option is online focus groups. So this is, again, when you bring together people from various places to participate online in the focus group experience remotely. And one advantage is that if you're looking for people of diverse backgrounds or diverse geographies, this can work really well. People can post when it's convenient for them, so especially if you're working with people who may have very different schedules from each other, and it's really hard to coordinate with them, allowing them to go online to be sort of virtually interviewed and answer questions whenever they have time could be best. Some people may be more willing to do this during the week, others on the weekend, others in the early morning hours, late hours, etc. So you're really affording them a lot of flexibility. It also gives them time to provide truly thoughtful responses because they have what we call soak time. They might go on and read the question and then wait a few hours and think about how they're going to respond to that question before they go and submit. Unlike a focus group in person or an interview in person, the answers you get are only those gathered on the spot. So it's people's initial reactions, their initial thoughts. They don't really have time to sort of soak on what you're saying and think more deeply about the subject and your questions. They do with this method. It's also less expensive. You're not trying to co-locate people. They can do it from the comfort of their own office or their own home. And so you don't need to incentivize them as much to participate. And it's faster for recruiting because it's less of a lift on the individual respondent. There are some drawbacks, as with all the methods. Respondent interaction is pretty limited. Sometimes we do these as open boards where they see each other's responses, sometimes they don't. But even with open boards where they can see each other's responses, because they're not really looking at the person and there isn't like a face with a voice that they're reading, the interaction may be somewhat limited. So if you're looking to do this in an environment where you really want to know what the dynamics are between the respondents and have them build off each other's ideas in that sense, it may or may not be the right method. It is easy for participants to drop off, so maybe if you're doing this over a week or two, they participate in the first few days and then, they get busy with other things and they don't finish the study. That is a liability. You can correct for this by over-recruiting and expecting some drop-offs, and we typically do that. But you do need to keep into account that if you start, for example, with 30 people, you're unlikely to finish with 30 people. And they also have to be willing to type a lot. So people often say it's easier to talk than it is to write. And so part of the deal here is that they have to be willing to type out all their responses and in as much detail as they would tell it to you if they were telling you a story or having a conversation with you. And they also need to be tech savvy enough to do this. So if you don't have a tech savvy population, this is not the right option. So now that you've recruited them and you've discussed on what method that you want to use, the next step is to create a good interview guide. And an interview guide should have a clear introduction that really sets up what the interview is and what it's about. Here you have to think carefully about how much detail you want to give up front about exactly the flow of the conversation and what you're going to be discussing so you don't bias their answers. But you do want to give them enough information so they understand the context and they know what's in scope and out of scope. People are very willing often to help you and they want to give you the information they need. Sometimes they may go off on tangents, and one great way to avoid this is by setting expectations right up front about these are the kinds of things we want to talk about and certain topics are out of scope. And you can tell them explicitly what's out of scope so that they know how to focus their responses on the information that's going to be most helpful to you. It should be an outline, not a script. You're not going to read it verbatim. You want it to sound natural. It should be conversational, but you want to make sure you have that focus. You also want to help build rapport, which is really important. You want to focus on their experiences. Questions that are around experiences often work much better than asking about a typical experience because there might not be anything that insightful about a typical experience, but it's really those peripheral, memorable experiences over the years that provide the best insights from your customer interviews. And you really want to make sure that you explore pain points. So things that didn't go well, don't be afraid to only look for good experiences, really probe on the negative as well. And always as you're designing your guide, you want to shift from the general questions at the beginning to more specific questions. And as you develop each section of the guide, each section should begin with the general questions about that section or topic, and then go to the really specific aided questions where you present the respondents with their answer choices and they haven't mentioned them previously and say, among these options, which is an important consideration for you, and suggest to them some topics that they'll want to go in depth with you on. An interview guide should have the following 6 sections ideally. So first is the introduction and the purpose, which we talked about. You want to start with some easy questions just to get them warmed up, like tell me about your role, or tell me about your experience in this industry. Then you want to take inventory, really understand what are all the considerations that you want to explore and what are their experiences with those. Then focus on some in-depth experiences. Ask them about extremes. Tell me about the best time. Tell me about the worst time something happened. That works very well both in a B2B and a B2C context. And then we often advise that you end with a magical what if question. So you might not always get responses from this, but this is the kind of question where you say, if you could design the ideal product that would do X, Y, Z, tell me, what would it look like? How would it function? And you're giving them an opportunity to be creative. Sometimes there may be very interesting insights or ideas there, and sometimes there won't be, but it's good to give them the opportunity. Specific questions you want to avoid are repetitive questions that require only a simple yes or no answer, questions that are leading or put words in the customer's mouth, like when will you be renewing your contract, or things that have an assumption in them. Egotistical questions that make them think it's all about you. So for example, how are we doing? Tell us about how we're performing. Ask them more about the industry. Ask them about the different players. Try to be less focused on your company and how you are performing. You also want to avoid unreliable questions that they can't truly answer. So for example, you need to be very careful how you ask about price. What's the maximum you would pay for a certain product or service? You're unlikely to get a true answer to this for two reasons. One, they might not know and may not be able to tell you. But two, even if they did know what their maximum price was, they might not be willing to share that with you. You also want to avoid suspicious questions that sound like you have some kind of a hidden agenda, like tell me what you're hearing from the competition or things like that. Make sure all the questions sound really genuine, and those are very important things to avoid as you're conducting the interviews. I do want to just take a moment to pause and emphasize the power of storytelling. We talked about experiences, but in all elements of collecting voice of the customer and conducting interviews, storytelling is truly powerful. It's powerful for really understanding in-depth customer wants and needs. It's powerful for being able to empathize with the customer. And it's also powerful when you go back to your own team to be able to share some anecdotes. It often works much better than just sharing the conclusions. Why elicit stories? So stories in particular help people recall additional experiential details that they might not think to tell you outright. It really creates an open and engaging experience. People love to tell stories. It gathers deeper level needs than you can gather just with a general conversation. It also helps overcome people's natural tendency to filter out information or try to think about what's truly relevant or not. They get engaged in the story. You might find things that are really important that they wouldn't think would be important to you. And it lets you understand unusual or extraordinary experiences, not just those typical experiences. Some tips for doing interviews. Don't try to ask every person every question in the guide. Every interview should be different. If they were all identical, we would only do one interview. With any individual interview, though, depth is more important than breadth. Different people are going to have different levels of depth that they can tell you about on your different questions. So allow them to go in depth into areas. Pull them back if they're going into too much depth. But don't expect everyone to answer every question, and especially not every question in depth. Expect that every interview will be different. Some will be more interesting than others. And the quality of the interview, good or bad, is not something you should take too personally either. Sometimes it's just the way the respondent is responding to the questions, and so that's okay. Not every interview will be an A+ interview. Probing, I want to emphasize how critical this is in conducting good interviews and gathering the voice of the customer. Keep asking why. Try to get to their real underlying needs. Why do you do this? Tell me about that. I noticed X, Y, Z. Tell me about that in more detail. Really probing on the why and telling people up front that you're going to ask why a lot so they're not caught off guard. Be inquisitive, but not judgmental. Often this can be conveyed by the tone that you choose to use. Keep them talking, encourage them to continue, watch for those non-verbal cues. And also look for keyword triggers. So we commonly write a list of words that we're going to want to probe on. Like when someone says the product is durable, what does durable mean? Ask for more details. And you want to paraphrase for a few reasons. One, to show your understanding and to make sure that you're showing empathy, and to capture the speaker's key points in case you're recording and going to do a transcript, which, by the way, we would say is best practice. If you don't know what a respondent is saying, have them clarify. Don't make any assumptions. And lastly, we're going to go over some do's and don'ts. So do remember important pieces of information mentioned earlier in the conversation. Watch the time and respect the person's schedule. Regroup after the interviews and make any changes needed. And we recommend assigning a grade to each interview so you know which are really the true interviews, the truly great interviews. In case someone says, well, I only have time to listen to one, you know which one to direct them to. Some don'ts: don't be afraid of tangents. Don't try to communicate, don't ever communicate boredom, even when you are, they're going over information you already know. Don't lose eye contact, and don't try to sell them anything. So we're just going to do a really quick 2-minute customer interview with Meg. So Meg, I want to talk about the topic is your shopping for clothing. So I want to talk about your decision to use online shopping versus in-store. Tell me about a time that you would shop online.
Online. A lot of times I'll shop online if I have a lot of time leading up to an event. So, you know, I could get the cheapest shipping option available, and if it comes in and it doesn't fit or I don't like it, I could have plenty of time to return it and get something new. So that would be one scenario that I might use online.
And what about in-store?
In-store, it's kind of the opposite. Like when I'm running really last minute, like I'm going away for a weekend, and 2 days before I decide I need something, and you know, I might just go to a store that's kind of close to my house and convenient, given the time I have.
And so tell me, when you're making the decision to shop, what are you thinking about when you're deciding to go online or in store? What would you say is the main decision-making criteria you're using?
Yeah, so like I said, it's time. The other might be like the item type. So
Tell me more about that.
yeah, so there's certain items I feel like are sometimes easier to guess how they might look when they come in. Like if it's a t-shirt or like a style that I have a lot of, I'll kind of just go for it because it's more predictable. But sometimes if it's like a newer, trendier style, something I've never really tried on, or like something really specific like a bathing suit or something, like those are things that I'd want to try a lot of different options and see how they look before I purchase them.
Could you tell me about a particularly good online shopping experience?
Yeah, last time I ordered a coat, I feel like they had a lot of like indications and about what size you should get and good size charts. There was a lot of reviews, and the pictures were really like clear to what the item looked like. So when I got it, there was really no surprises, and it was just what I wanted, and I was happy with it.
Great. And lastly, tell me about a really negative experience you've had shopping online.
Yeah, I had to buy a dress a few weeks ago, a specific dress for a friend's wedding, and it came in and it was just nothing what I was expecting. It didn't look like it did online at all.
So as you can see, we only had a couple minutes to go over that, but I asked her about her behavior generally. I started with some general questions, and then we really dove into specific experiences. Had I had more time, I would have started to probe on some of the words that she used, like that word predictability. I could really latch on to that and get more information about what makes an item predictable and how does that factor into the decision. So that's all the time that we have today. I think we might have time for just a couple questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Meg to see what questions we have.
Sure. Great. Looks like we have a couple questions. And again, if you want to submit a question, you can do so in the chat box on the right side of your screen. But the first question, Carmel, that I see is, what do you do with the data and how do you analyze it?
Great question. So as I alluded to before, we typically recommend recording and transcribing all of the interviews so that you have a written record. This is really important so you're not relying exclusively on your memory of what you heard, and you're not filtering any information off the bat. Typically, we read those transcripts, and we have a process that we'd be happy to tell you more about where we actually highlight the transcripts and the statements and convert them into customer needs. That's really both an art and a science. And to go back to the paper, The Voice of the Customer, that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, there is a complete process that we recommend and has been proven to be very effective based on that paper to really identify customer wants and needs in a systematic way to ensure a full database.
Okay, great. And the other question we have is, what if I'm on a really tight timeline, and how would you quicken this process?
Sure. So if you're on a very tight timeline, you may want to consider focus groups versus one-on-one interviews. Sometimes we'll use a mix of different methods to do this. Sometimes a company might say, well, we're going to do some of the interviews ourselves. We're going to do some of the interviews by having someone else who's a professional interviewer do those concurrently, just to speed up the process. Also, as we conduct interviews, we do the recording and right away, and then the transcription on an ongoing basis, so we can start the analysis as the interviews are being conducted. So there's a lot of tips and tricks to really speed up the process, and we'd be happy to talk to you in more depth about how you can really manage your timeline.
Okay, great. Well, that's all the questions we have today, it looks like. Thank you, everyone, for joining this coffee break webinar, and hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Thank you.